Now, if we go to the other side of the agribusiness chain, and we ask Bill Egbe as Group Director of the Coca-Cola Company. Bill, you're one of the continent's largest employers. So you have a wealth of knowledge that the public sector could benefit from about how to create more commercial and globally competitive agribusiness investment opportunities. So with that in mind, what do you think is required from the public and private sectors to boost agribusiness job creation and as well as access to export markets?
Thanks, Barbara. Good afternoon, everybody. I think a lot of what is needed is pretty straightforward and pretty intuitive. Based on our experience trying to integrate, local or smallholder farmers into our value chain in parts of East Africa, the key thing is just the need for some kind of collaboration and coordinated action between the government and the private sector on the key things that the smallholder farmers would need, for example, to be able to plug into our value chains. And I'm talking about being able to partner on building skills on a targeted basis, very specific skills that they need to be able to raise the quality to be competitive globally. It's about specific training to enable them to drive productivity and to be more reliable suppliers to a global value chain. Those kinds of things are things which you can try to do on one side, like in the private sector, but you're more effective if you're able to get coordinated action by both the private sector and the public sector. We ran a big project in Uganda, for example, reaching 50,000 smallholder farmers. And the key to being able to raise the skill level of those farmers to be able to plug into a value chain was being able to convince the government to allow us to integrate 1,500 government officers into the training program to help us with deploying and reaching these farmers. This was a case where we brought the resources for the training, but we leveraged existing capacity within the government to help us reach the farmers. So that kind of coordinated action is quite critical, I believe. Another area where it's important for us to have coordinated action is just access to information, knowledge, and expertise. I mean, the public sector has access to this information and expertise, and sometimes I think we struggle to bring it to bear to enable some of these players in the value chain to be more effective. And in this case, I think a good example was just we were able to help the farmers again in Uganda. We found examples from India where they were practicing certain agricultural methods that were very relevant for Uganda. And we found out because we were doing similar projects in India. But I think leveraging the government's contacts, we were able to transfer not just the knowledge, but some experts to come and help in Uganda. And I think that kind of partnership helped us move much faster. So that's about coordinated action and collaboration to help us transfer knowledge, bring skills much faster. But the second part that is even more important, I think, is the ability to co-invest. I think, there's some priority areas for us to accelerate agribusiness in Africa that need some degree of co-investment to accelerate things. And I'm talking about our experience showed that in basic elements like just storage, processing capacity, some basic logistics to enable these local farmers to be able to plug into a global supply chain, they just lacked a few bits and pieces of infrastructure, which a private sector player that's not primarily based on building infrastructure could not do on their own. But by partnering with government, to be able to say, okay, well, storage is something which if we put our resources together, we can help these 50,000 farmers to build the storage facilities for their mangoes so we could be able to export internationally. I think that kind of collaboration worked very well. The ability to co-invest proved very useful in this case. And the last element that I think is also quite obvious, but is critical to enable these small players to plug into the global value chain is around just making sure that we can invest in getting the standards, the quality standards that are required to be competitive internationally are being approached. We know they will not be there day one, but I believe that in some of these examples, in South Africa, for example, making the investment to ensure that the farmers understand the quality standards, will put them on a path towards reaching those. Things like providing labs where they could test their vegetables or fruits to make sure that you could have consistent proof that you don't have pesticides in these products was basic stuff which wasn't there before. But by co-investing in these elements, we're able to plug these farmers into a global supply chain that was able to supply processing plants that were outside the African continent. So some of these basics are, they seem obvious, but until you get into the field and start working on these and find the right partners on the other side with whom you can collaborate on these, sometimes it is more difficult than you would think. They're obvious, but it requires willing parties on both sides to put their heads together and find a solution on how to create the right agreements on how to partner on these things. I believe collaboration and partnership in trying to meet some of these needs is the most fundamental need, is the most fundamental element that's required to accelerate agribusiness in Africa. And if we are able to partner with the government effectively, I think we can scale up the things that we're doing and be able to provide a more sustainable outlet for some of the capacity that we have in agriculture on the continent.
Your points resonated very deeply because we've worked with agribusiness projects in Uganda, for example, IKU, 30,000 farmers for milk processing. And before we move on to banking, I can't help but just voice that when we listened earlier to the heads of state speaking about the national and regional competitive strengths in their countries, and this is a comment and would love to hear people respond, but to me, in Monterey in 2002, we had the concept. We have the concept again in Addis. What I think we're missing is the machinery, because when you look, for example, in Uganda, if you're looking to work with local government official NADS, okay, the agricultural service, it is a mess. Okay, dysfunctional. If you look at the Uganda Board of Standards, they won't even go to Kayunga district to be able to help a local women's cooperative of wine be able to meet the requirements for national or exports. So there's, and I think if we think about the objective of this meeting and thinking through how do we in the private sector with our public sector colleagues really think what we need to tell heads of state, how they're going to operationalize this great need to mobilize private sector capital. We really need to take the experience of people like yourself and boil it down into operational terms so they can understand how to better manage the governmental functions in a concrete way. So with that, I shouldn't be going on. We should move now to banking.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.